the German army had Moscow in its sights. In the summer of 1941, the Wehrmacht was advancing deep into Soviet territory, moving fast and breaking everything in its path. Operation Barbarossa was in full swing, and German generals believed they were weeks, maybe even days away from crushing the Soviet Union. Take Moscow, the Soviet capital, the nerve center of communications, railways, and politics. History had shown that when a capital falls, the country often collapses soon after. The logic was simple. If you cut off the head, the body dies. But Adolf Hitler didn't care about logic, not when his ego got in the way. He looked at the map and decided that the generals were wrong. He thought victory wasn't in Moscow, was in the south. There, the land was rich with grain, and even more tempting, there was oil. Hitler believed that taking Ukraine and the Caucasus oil fields would give Germany the fuel it needed to power its tanks, planes, and trucks forever. In his mind, why bother with Moscow when he could grab the resources that would fuel his empire? It was a decision that would change the entire course of the war. By August 1941, the German army had already made incredible gains. In just a few weeks, they had destroyed entire Soviet armies, captured hundreds of thousands of prisoners, and advanced hundreds of miles into the Soviet Union. The Wehrmacht was stretched thin, but morale was high. Hitler's generals, men like Heinz Guderian, Fedor von Bock, and Franz Halder, were urging him to strike directly at Moscow. They believed that capturing the capital before winter would break Soviet morale and paralyze their military coordination. Guderian, the father of modern tank warfare, argued that Moscow wasn't just symbolic, it was the main hub of Soviet logistics. Take Moscow, and the Red Army's ability to fight would collapse. But Hitler saw things differently. In his headquarters, staring at maps filled with red and blue lines, he began to doubt his general's advice. He believed that the Soviet Union was already collapsing, and that Moscow wasn't as important as they thought. He saw the Soviet forces regrouping in the south, near Kiev, and decided that eliminating them would be a bigger prize. He also wanted the food from Ukraine and the oil from the Caucasus to feed his army and fuel his machines. In his mind, the war was about resources, land, food, and fuel, not cities. So, in late August, against the advice of almost every senior officer he had, Hitler gave a new order. Instead of continuing the drive toward Moscow, the central thrust of the German army would turn south to help capture Kiev. This meant that tens of thousands of tanks, trucks, and troops would leave the Moscow front and head hundreds of miles away to fight a different battle. It was a massive diversion, one that would take precious time, fuel, and energy away from the main objective. His generals were stunned. Guderian reportedly begged Hitler to reconsider, warning that the delay would doom any chance of taking Moscow before winter. Hitler refused to listen. The results were mixed at first. The Battle of Kiev turned into one of the largest encirclements in military history. The Germans surrounded and captured over 600,000 Soviet soldiers, an incredible tactical victory. Hitler saw it as proof that he had been right all along. He bragged that his strategy had destroyed the Red Army's southern flank and secured the agricultural and resource regions that Germany desperately needed. But beneath the surface, the cost was staggering. The delay of over a month gave the Soviets precious time to regroup, rebuild, and reinforce the defenses around Moscow. What looked like a victory on paper was actually a ticking time bomb. By the time the Germans finally turned their attention back toward Moscow in October 1941, everything had changed. The weather was turning, the roads were turning into mud, and the Red Army had rebuilt its defenses. Hitler launched Operation Typhoon, the final push toward Moscow, with confidence. But the conditions were already against him. The famous Rasputitsa, the Russian season of mud, turned roads into swamps. Tanks and trucks sank into the earth. Supplies that should have arrived in days took weeks. The fast-moving blitzkrieg that had crushed Poland and France was now crawling at a snail's pace. The Soviets, meanwhile, were far from finished. Under Stalin's brutal orders, new armies were formed from deep inside the country. Factories were relocated east, beyond the Ural Mountains, where German planes couldn't reach them. Civilians dug trenches around Moscow, and thousands of soldiers were brought in from Siberia, battle-hardened troops trained to fight in the freezing cold. These reinforcements were only possible because the delay had given the Soviets time to prepare. Hitler had handed them the breathing space they needed to survive. By November, the Germans could see the spires of Moscow in the distance. but their strength was gone. They had marched nearly 2,000 kilometers, fought endless battles, and were now facing temperatures as low as -30 degrees Celsius. Engines froze, weapons jammed, and soldiers suffered frostbite so severe that many had to be carried off the front lines. The German army wasn't equipped for winter warfare. Hitler hadn't planned for it. He was so confident that Moscow would fall quickly that he hadn't issued proper winter uniforms or supplies. The once invincible Wehrmacht now faced starvation, disease, and the relentless cold. When the Soviets finally launched their counteroffensive in early December, it was devastating. Fresh Siberian troops, dressed for the cold and supported by tanks and artillery, slammed into the exhausted German lines. The Wehrmacht, already at its limit, was pushed back for the first time. The myth of German invincibility was shattered. What was supposed to be the final knockout blow of the war turned into the beginning of a long, brutal struggle that Germany would never recover from. And it all came down to one decision. When Hitler diverted his forces south instead of pushing for Moscow, he didn't just lose time, he lost the war's momentum. The German army, which had thrived on speed and surprise, was now trapped in a slow, grinding battle that drained its strength. The delay turned what could have been a decisive victory into a catastrophic stalemate. Imagine you're running a race and you're just a few meters from the finish line. You can see the ribbon ahead, and you know that one last sprint will win it. But instead, you stop to grab a drink of water and admire the scenery. By the time you start running again, the race is already lost. That's exactly what happened to Hitler in 1941. His decision to divert his army south didn't just waste time, it handed the Soviets the chance to turn the tide. In military terms, the Moscow diversion was a textbook example of how pride destroys strategy. Hitler thought he knew better than his generals, men who had spent their entire lives studying warfare. He believed his instincts were infallible, that his gut feeling about the war's direction was superior to professional military judgment. But wars aren't won by gut feelings. They're won by timing, logistics, and focus. Hitler ignored all of that, and his army paid the price in blood and frozen corpses. The irony is that even though the Germans captured millions of Soviet soldiers in the south, it didn't matter. The Soviet Union could replace its losses. It had the population, the land, and the industrial depth to fight back. What it needed most was time, and Hitler gave it to them. That delay before Moscow was the breathing space the Soviets needed to reorganize, rebuild, and eventually overwhelm Germany. In hindsight, this moment when the German army turned away from Moscow was one of the defining turning points of the entire war. Everything that came afterward, the brutal winters, the disaster at Stalingrad, the collapse in the east, all of it traces back to that single, arrogant decision. Hitler's obsession with resources over strategy turned a winnable campaign into a doomed war of attrition. And that's how the German army, standing on the doorstep of Moscow, lost the greatest prize of all because of one man's ego and greed. What could have been the moment of victory became the beginning of defeat. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the bad decisions that shaped history, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian, where we turn history's greatest blunders into lessons worth remembering. When the German invasion of the Soviet Union began in June 1941, every general in Hitler's high command understood one thing. The capture of Moscow was not only symbolic, it was strategically vital. The Soviet capital was the nerve center of command and communication, the hub of rail networks, and the industrial and political heart of the entire Soviet war effort. If the Wehrmacht could reach Moscow before winter, the Red Army would collapse. But instead of pressing the attack on the Soviet capital, Hitler made a choice that defied every principle of military strategy. He ordered his armies to turn south, chasing resources and territory instead of victory. This decision, known as the diversion from Moscow, was one of the most fateful of the war. It came in August 1941, at a moment when the Germans still had the initiative. Army Group Center, under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, had advanced hundreds of miles into Soviet territory, defeating massive Soviet formations and standing less than 200 miles from Moscow. The German generals wanted to strike immediately while the Red Army was disorganized. They argued that seizing Moscow would shatter Soviet morale and cripple coordination. But Hitler saw the situation differently. He was obsessed with resources: Ukraine's vast grain fields, the mineral wealth of the Donbass, and the oil fields far to the south. He believed that conquering these economic assets would starve the Soviet Union of the means to continue the war. On paper, this seemed logical to Hitler. The Nazi war machine was consuming enormous quantities of fuel, food, and raw materials, and Germany lacked the long-term means to sustain such a vast campaign. But the reasoning was flawed because it ignored the immediate strategic objective: the destruction of the Soviet army before it could recover. Hitler was thinking like a conqueror, not a commander. His generals were thinking in terms of military reality. The debate that followed turned into one of the fiercest arguments in the German high command. Guderian, commander of the 2nd Panzer Group, warned that every day lost was a day gained by the Soviets. The Red Army was regrouping and reinforcing Moscow's defenses. Fuel and ammunition were already running low, and the weather was starting to turn. But Hitler dismissed these concerns as pessimism. He believed the Red Army was already finished in his mind. All that remained was to seize the economic heart of the Soviet Union. So he ordered Guderian and other armored units to turn south and assist Army Group South in encircling Soviet forces around Kiev. The result was one of the largest encirclements in history. Nearly 700,000 Soviet soldiers were captured in the Battle of Kiev. On the surface, it looked like a stunning victory. German propaganda hailed it as proof of Hitler's genius, but in reality, it was a Pyrrhic success. The diversion cost the Germans 6 critical weeks. By the time Army Group Center was allowed to resume the advance on Moscow, the weather had changed. The autumn rains turned roads into rivers of mud, halting movement and wrecking supply lines. Fuel trucks and artillery wagons sank axle-deep in sludge. Tanks broke down. The same divisions that could have reached Moscow in August were now crawling through mud in October. The obsession with resources also revealed a deeper problem in Hitler's thinking. He treated war as an economic equation, not a logistical one. He believed that capturing territory automatically meant gaining usable resources. But the Soviet scorched earth policy ensured that the Germans gained nothing of immediate value. As the Wehrmacht advanced, Soviet engineers destroyed railways, burned crops, and evacuated factories eastward beyond the Urals. The fields of Ukraine were empty. The oil fields of the Caucasus were still hundreds of miles away, and the German army was no closer to ending the war. Meanwhile, the Red Army was recovering. Soviet reinforcements from Siberia and the Far East began arriving near Moscow. These troops were well-trained, battle-hardened, and equipped for winter fighting. They had been held in reserve in case of Japanese aggression, but with intelligence confirming Japan's focus on the Pacific, Stalin redeployed them west. Every week, the Germans lingered in the south gave Stalin more time to strengthen his defenses around the capital. By October, when Hitler finally renewed the push toward Moscow under Operation Typhoon, it was already too late. The Wehrmacht launched one final offensive, but the delay had given the Soviets exactly what they needed: time, space, and reinforcements. The mud soon turned to snow, and temperatures dropped far below freezing. Engines froze. Soldiers wrapped themselves in rags and newspaper for warmth. The advance slowed, then stopped entirely on the outskirts of Moscow. If Hitler had struck in August instead of October, the Germans might have reached Moscow before the weather and before the Soviet line solidified. The Red Army was in disarray, its supply lines in chaos. The fall of the capital would not have guaranteed Soviet surrender, but it would have crippled command and coordination. Instead, Hitler's diversion turned a potentially decisive campaign into a drawn-out war of attrition, the very kind of conflict which Germany could not win. The fixation on Ukraine and the Caucasus also exposed a flaw in Hitler's leadership style. He did not trust his generals' professional judgment. The decision to divert forces south was not based on battlefield intelligence or logistical planning. It was dictated from the top, driven by Hitler's ideological view that war was a contest of will and that economic conquest would secure long-term victory. When generals like Guderian and Halder protested, Hitler accused them of lacking faith. Guderian was so furious that he flew to Hitler's headquarters to argue in person. The meeting ended with Hitler shouting that Moscow means nothing. That statement would haunt Germany for the rest of the war. The irony is that Hitler's economic gamble failed even on its own terms. The resources he sought never became usable. The oil fields remained out of reach, the agricultural regions were destroyed, and the manpower required to occupy these vast territories drained the fighting strength of his armies. The The German supply network, already stretched thin across thousands of kilometers, could not support simultaneous offensives north, center, and south. Each division sent south meant fewer men and tanks available for the main objective. When the winter came, those logistical gaps turned catastrophic. Inside the Wehrmacht's headquarters, many officers privately acknowledged that the diversion had been a disaster. The delay not only allowed the Soviets to regroup, but also ensured that the German army would have to fight through another Russian winter, something that had defeated Napoleon more than a century earlier. The same mistakes repeated themselves: overconfidence, stretched supply lines, and underestimation of both the enemy and the environment. As 1941 ended, the myth of the unstoppable Wehrmacht began to crumble. Operation Barbarossa, once envisioned as a lightning campaign, had become a frozen stalemate. Hitler's armies stood outside Moscow, exhausted and freezing, while Soviet counterattacks drove them back. The German dream of a quick victory in the East was over. The decision to chase resources instead of finishing the enemy had transformed a winnable campaign into an unwinnable war. It was a decision born from greed and arrogance, a belief that ideology and willpower could replace strategy and logistics. Hitler's focus on economic plunder ignored the simple truth that wars are won by destroying armies, not by seizing territory. Every kilometer gained in Ukraine came at the cost of time, fuel, and lives, and none of it brought him closer to defeating the Soviet Union. By the time the snow fell over Moscow, the outcome of the Eastern Front had already been decided. The momentum was gone, the enemy was recovering, and the German army was trapped in a war of attrition it could never sustain. The dream of victory died not in the snows of December, but in the heat of August, when Hitler turned his gaze from Moscow to the south and chose resources over rationale. Time, the one thing an army can never get back. In 1941, Hitler handed it to the Soviets like a gift wrapped in arrogance. When he diverted his forces south instead of taking Moscow, he didn't just delay his campaign. He gave the Red Army the single most valuable resource in war. That pause in momentum, those few weeks of hesitation, would prove more deadly than any Soviet counterattack. It let Stalin and his generals breathe, regroup, and transform chaos into strategy. And when the Germans finally turned their attention back to Moscow, they found not a broken enemy, but a fortified one, ready to fight to the death. In June 1941, when Operation Barbarossa began, everything had gone Germany's way. The Wehrmacht was unstoppable. In less than 3 months, it had torn through Soviet defenses, captured millions of prisoners, and advanced hundreds of miles across vast stretches of land. Every victory reinforced Hitler's belief that the Soviet Union was on the brink of collapse. He thought one final blow would finish them, and for a moment, that seemed true. German tanks stood within reach of Moscow, the political and logistical heart of the USSR. But when Hitler diverted his armies south toward Kiev, everything changed. What looked like a tactical masterstroke, surrounding and capturing over 500,000 Soviet troops, came with a hidden cost. That cost was time. While German soldiers were busy fighting in Ukraine and marching through endless fields, the Soviets were reorganizing their defense lines north of them. Stalin used those critical weeks to move factories, rebuild divisions, and prepare new defenses. It was a massive, desperate national effort to keep Moscow alive. The Soviet Union wasn't just buying time, it was manufacturing survival. From the moment Hitler hesitated, the entire Soviet war machine began to shift eastward. Whole factories, steelworks, tank plants, and aircraft assembly lines were dismantled piece by piece and shipped beyond the Ural Mountains, far from the reach of German bombers. Thousands of trains carried equipment, workers, and supplies to safety. When those factories started running again, the Soviet Union would have the industrial power to fight a long war, something Hitler had imagined possible. Meanwhile, Stalin used every second of that delay to reinforce Moscow. Defensive rings were dug around the capital, lines of trenches, bunkers, and anti-tank barriers stretching for miles. Civilians, soldiers, and even children worked day and night, digging, building, and fortifying. The Soviet leadership knew that if Moscow fell, morale would collapse, communication would break down, and the war might be lost. But if it held, the Soviet Union could endure. And then came the reinforcements from the east, the Siberian divisions. These were not regular troops. They were tough, battle-hardened soldiers from the frozen frontiers of the USSR, trained to fight in extreme cold, wearing proper winter gear, and equipped with weapons that didn't jam in freezing temperatures. Stalin had held them in reserve, worried about a possible Japanese invasion from the east. But when Soviet spies confirmed that Japan would not attack, he sent these divisions west to defend Moscow. Those Siberian soldiers would never have arrived in time if Hitler hadn't stalled. The delay gave them the window they needed to travel thousands of miles by rail to the front lines. When they finally arrived, the German army was exhausted, underfed, and ill-equipped for the brutal winter that was about to begin. By late October 1941, the Germans were ready to move on Moscow again, but the world around them had turned to mud. The infamous Rasputitsa, the Russian season of rain, had begun. Endless autumn downpours turned roads into rivers of sludge. Trucks sank up to their axles. Horses collapsed in exhaustion. Tanks, the pride of the Blitzkrieg, became useless steel coffins stuck in the muck. The soldiers cursed as they tried to push vehicles forward, but it was no use. The speed that had made them unstoppable in France and Poland was gone. By the time the ground froze and the mud hardened, winter had arrived. The temperature plunged below -30 degrees Celsius. Engines refused to start. Oil froze in the tanks. Weapons jammed. Soldiers wrapped rags around their hands and feet because they didn't have proper winter uniforms. Hitler had prepared for a winter campaign. He had promised his troops that the war would be over long before the snow fell. Instead, they were stranded in the open, freezing, hungry, and exhausted. The Soviets, on the other hand, were built for this. The same cold that crippled the Germans became their greatest ally. Trains brought in supplies and reinforcements, and Moscow's defenses thickened every day. When the German soldiers finally reached the outskirts of the city, they found themselves staring down a wall of resistance they hadn't expected. Every village, every street, every trench was defended. Soviet snipers hid in the snow. Artillery thundered from concealed positions. Civilians threw Molotov cocktails at tanks. The closer the Germans came, the harder the Soviets fought. The irony of the situation was brutal. The Germans had delayed their attack to chase oil and farmland, but by the time they returned north, they couldn't even fuel their own tanks. The fuel they needed was hundreds of miles away, trapped in the logistics nightmare of muddy, frozen roads. Supply lines stretched too thin to function. Soldiers had to scavenge for food. Horses froze where they stood. The once disciplined Wehrmacht was now fighting just to survive, and when Stalin launched his counteroffensive in December 1941, it was devastating. The fresh Siberian divisions slammed into the exhausted Germans, driving them back dozens of miles from Moscow. For the first time in the war, the Nazi war machine was forced to retreat. Hitler's invincible army, which had seemed unstoppable just months earlier, now stood battered, broken, and humiliated. All because of a delay, a single choice that changed everything. Hitler's obsession with resources had blinded him to strategy. He thought the war could be won by capturing land and oil fields, but wars aren't won by territory alone. They're won by timing, focus, and momentum, and he had thrown all three away. The time he gave to the Soviets was like oxygen to a drowning man. It allowed them to regroup, retrain, and rearm. It turned Moscow from a vulnerable target into an unbreakable fortress. It transformed the Red Army from a shattered force into a resilient, coordinated defense. That gift of time was the foundation of every Soviet victory that followed, from Moscow to Stalingrad, from Kursk to Berlin. It's hard to overstate just how monumental this mistake was. Hitler didn't just lose a few weeks. He lost the war's tempo, the element of surprise, and the psychological dominance that the Blitzkrieg had built. Once the Soviets realized that Germany could be stopped, the myth of Nazi invincibility shattered. The war turned from a sprint into a marathon, and in a marathon, the side with more endurance always wins. Imagine the irony. The same man who had conquered Europe through speed and aggression fell victim to his own impatience. He couldn't wait to finish one victory before chasing another. He didn't see that by dividing his focus, he had divided his strength. The diversion from Moscow was the moment Germany stopped winning quickly and started losing slowly. And that's the cruel truth behind this decision. The German army didn't lose Moscow because it was weak. It lost because its leader was too arrogant to listen, too greedy to focus, and too proud to wait. That pause, that redirection of energy, was a silent turning point in history. The Germans gave their enemy time, and the Soviets turned that time into victory. If you're learning something new, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian, where we turn the world's worst decisions into unforgettable stories. By the time the German army resumed its advance toward Moscow in October 1941, the window for victory had already closed. The delays caused by Hitler's diversions south meant the Wehrmacht was now racing against not just the Red Army, but nature itself. The Russian autumn had turned the roads into oceans of mud, slowing tanks and supply convoys to a crawl. The soldiers called it Rasputitz this season, when the earth itself turned against them. But as the last of the mud froze solid in November, the German commanders made a fatal decision. They pushed forward again, believing they could still seize Moscow before winter fully set in. What followed was not an offensive, it was a slow, freezing collapse. The German army that moved toward Moscow that winter was exhausted, undersupplied, and ill-prepared for what was coming. The men wore thin field uniforms suited for summer in Europe, not for temperatures that could plunge below minus 30 degrees Celsius. They had no insulated boots, no gloves, no proper winter gear of any kind. The German High Command had expected the campaign to end before the onset of winter, so they had made no preparations for prolonged fighting in the cold. This assumption would kill tens of thousands of men before a single bullet was fired. The first cold wave hit in late November. The diesel in trucks and tanks froze solid overnight. Engines wouldn't start without fires lit under them. Lubricants turned into sludge. Weapons jammed. Machine guns froze, bolts stuck, and rifles misfired. Soldiers had to warm their gun barrels with their hands or light fires just to make them function. Those same fires, though, drew Soviet artillery. Men froze in their trenches because they were too afraid to give away their position. Frostbite spread faster than the front lines. Fingers, noses, and ears turned black. In some divisions, frostbite accounted for more casualties than combat. Men used newspapers and straw stuffed into their boots for insulation. Others cut up horse blankets to wrap around their legs. There are reports of soldiers pulling the felt linings out of Russian houses, or even looting civilian coats just to stay alive. Yet, no matter how much they improvised, the cold always won. The Wehrmacht's logistics system, already strained from months of fighting, broke down completely. The supply lines stretched over 1,000 kilometers back to Germany. Trains could not run because Soviet partisans kept sabotaging tracks. Trucks got stuck in ice. The few supplies that reached the front were insufficient. Soldiers went days without food. Bread froze so hard that men had to cut it with bayonets. Water was impossible to find. Melting snow was the only option. In these conditions, even the smallest mistake became deadly. A spilled cup of water could freeze to a man's uniform. Sweat could turn into ice on his skin. Despite this, Hitler refused to halt the offensive. His generals begged him to allow their armies to dig in for the winter and regroup. But he was obsessed with taking Moscow before the end of the year. He believed that a final push would force the Soviets to surrender. "The Russian is finished," he kept saying, even as temperatures dropped lower every night. So the German troops pushed on. The advance was painfully slow. Horses collapsed in the snow. Men pulled artillery by hand because the vehicles had stopped working. The Soviets, meanwhile, were fighting on familiar ground. They were equipped with padded winter uniforms, fur-lined boots, and white camouflage. Their weapons were designed to function in sub-zero temperatures. Unlike the Germans, they knew how to survive in this kind of cold. The Red Army took advantage of this. Soviet snipers hid in snowdrifts, invisible until they fired. Mortar teams shelled German positions at night, knowing the Germans couldn't move their frozen guns fast enough to return fire. Soviet tanks, especially the T-34, proved nearly unstoppable. Their wide tracks and powerful engines allowed them to move across frozen terrain, while German panzers sat immobilized. The Germans, once the masters of mobility and precision, now found themselves stranded in a frozen wasteland, unable to maneuver or maintain their machines. Inside the ranks, morale began to collapse. The men were starving, freezing, and losing faith. Letters home spoke of the same despair. "We are no longer soldiers," one German wrote. "We are snowmen with rifles." Entire units were reduced to skeleton crews. Their numbers thinned not just by combat, but by the weather itself. Medical supplies were non-existent. Doctors had to amputate frostbitten limbs with saws heated over candles. In many cases, infection followed anyway, and the wounded froze to death before dawn. The human toll was staggering. By the end of December 1941, the German army had suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties, not from enemy fire, but from the cold. Frostbite alone accounted for over 100,000 non-combat injuries. The corpses of frozen soldiers were left by the roadside, too hard to bury, their faces locked in expressions of agony. Even horses, vital for transport, died in droves, their bodies piled beside the roads like ice sculptures. At the same time, the Soviet counterattack began. Reinforced by Siberian divisions fresh from the east, the Red Army launched a massive offensive in early December. The Germans were taken completely by surprise. They could barely hold their rifles, let alone dig new trenches or reposition their artillery. Soviet soldiers in white camouflage surged through the snow, striking weak points and surrounding isolated German units. Entire regiments were wiped out or forced to retreat in chaos. The once unstoppable Wehrmacht was now fighting for survival. What made the situation even worse was the German refusal to retreat. Hitler's orders were clear: no withdrawal, no step back, no surrender of ground. His commanders, terrified of disobedience, held their frozen positions even when it meant annihilation. Some units fought until they were completely surrounded, their supplies gone, their weapons frozen. They died where they stood, often without ever seeing the enemy that killed them. The scenes along the front were nightmarish. Men huddled together in shell holes for warmth. Those who fell asleep often never woke up. Campfires were forbidden in many sectors because they gave away positions to Soviet artillery. So soldiers tried to warm themselves by holding hot stones or burning bits of wood in their helmets. Some units resorted to eating the flesh of their dead horses to stay alive. The winter turned the entire front into a graveyard. By early 1942, the German army was no longer the offensive juggernaut it had been 6 months earlier. The soldiers who had marched into the Soviet Union full of confidence were now shadows of themselves. The uniforms that once symbolized power and precision were now tattered rags. The Wehrmacht had entered Russia as an invading force and ended the year as a starving, frostbitten mass of survivors clinging to life in the snow. Hitler refused to acknowledge the scale of the disaster. From his headquarters in East Prussia, he blamed his generals, the weather, even fate, but never his own decisions. He insisted the winter was an unforeseeable event, though his own meteorologists had warned him months earlier. He ignored every lesson from history, including Napoleon's defeat in the same land a century before. He had gambled everything on one campaign and lost it to a season he didn't prepare for. The winter trap was not just a matter of temperature, it was a trap of arrogance, ignorance, and denial. The German army had advanced deep into the Soviet Union, with no plan for endurance, no understanding of the terrain, and no respect for the enemy's resilience. They believed they could conquer a continent in a few months. Instead, they found themselves buried in snow, watching their empire's ambitions freeze around them. The freezing winds of December 1941 marked the turning point of the entire war in the East. The Blitzkrieg, the lightning war that had crushed Europe, died in the ice outside Moscow. What began as a campaign of conquest ended as a desperate struggle for survival. The same roads that carried German tanks toward Moscow were now littered with frozen corpses, burned-out vehicles, and shattered dreams of victory. The German army never fully recovered from that winter. The cold had done what no army had managed. Before it, stopped Hitler's war machine dead in its tracks. By the winter of 1941, the once invincible German army, the same army that had crushed France in 6 weeks and conquered half of Europe, was breaking apart in the freezing fields outside Moscow. Soldiers were dying not from bullets, but from frostbite, starvation, and exhaustion. The Blitzkrieg that had promised lightning victories had turned into a slow death in the snow, and all of it traced back to one fatal choice: Hitler's decision to divert his forces from Moscow. It was the moment the war slipped from his grasp, the decision that turned a potential victory into the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. At the heart of the disaster was timing. The entire German war plan depended on speed. Blitzkrieg lightning war wasn't just a tactic. It was the foundation of German military success. It relied on fast, overwhelming attacks that crushed enemies before they could respond. Every battle, every campaign, was built around momentum. Once that momentum stopped, the entire strategy began to collapse. By diverting his troops south in the middle of the Moscow campaign, Hitler destroyed that momentum. When the German army turned back toward Moscow in late 1941, it was too late. The weather had shifted, the enemy had reorganized, and the window for a quick victory had closed. The tanks that once raced across Europe now crawled through mud and snow. The soldiers who had believed the war would end before Christmas now froze in trenches. The morale that once fueled their unstoppable drive turned into bitterness and despair. The diversion didn't just delay the attack, it changed the nature of the war itself. Germany had built its military for short, decisive campaigns. It didn't have the industrial depth, the manpower, or the supply infrastructure for a long, grinding conflict like the one that followed. When Hitler's armies failed to take Moscow, they were forced into a drawn-out war of attrition against an opponent that had far greater resources. That was a war Germany could never win. The effects of that one choice rippled through every part of the German war effort. The delay drained fuel, supplies, and men. Tanks and aircraft wore out faster than they could be replaced. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles across hostile territory, exposed to Soviet attacks. Every extra day spent on the road meant fewer rations, fewer bullets, and more exhaustion. The soldiers called it the Road of Hunger. In the field, the army's condition deteriorated quickly. Many soldiers had no winter uniforms. Some wrapped themselves in stolen blankets, others tore apart curtains or used newspapers as insulation inside their boots. Weapons jammed in the cold, and frostbite claimed more men than enemy fire. Commanders begged for supplies, but the logistics network was in chaos. Hitler's generals had warned him months earlier that the army was not prepared for a winter campaign. He ignored them. And while the Germans suffered, the Soviets adapted. The Red Army, which had been on the verge of collapse, learned from its mistakes. Soviet factories, relocated east of the Urals, began producing tanks, artillery, and rifles at an astonishing rate. Every week, more reinforcements arrived at the front. Soviet troops had proper winter gear, better mobility, and shorter supply routes. They used skis to move across the snow and camouflaged themselves in white uniforms. They fought like the land itself was on their side. The psychological shift was just as devastating as the physical one. The myth of German invincibility shattered outside Moscow. The same troops who once believed in the certainty of victory now began to doubt. They saw their leaders making desperate, irrational orders. They realized that Hitler's personal interference, his constant micromanaging and refusal to listen to experienced generals, was costing lives. Morale broke as the retreat began. That retreat was not an organized withdrawal. It was chaos. Entire divisions fell apart. Trucks were abandoned, tanks were left frozen in the snow, and thousands of soldiers froze to death during the march back. The German army, once the most efficient fighting machine in the world, had been reduced to a desperate, starving mob struggling to stay alive. This was the turning point of World War II. After the failure at Moscow, Germany never regained the initiative on the Eastern Front. Every offensive that followed at Stalingrad, Kursk, and beyond was an attempt to recover from the damage done in 1941. But the momentum was gone. The Soviet Union, having survived its near-death experience, was now fighting with purpose and growing confidence. Stalin understood that the worst was behind him. He knew the Germans had overextended themselves, that their industry couldn't keep pace with the demands of a long war. The Soviet Union, by contrast, was mobilizing every resource, every factory, every man and woman to push the invaders back. The longer the war dragged on, the stronger the Soviets became. Hitler's fatal diversion had also exposed another weakness, his obsession with control. He refused to delegate real authority to his generals. Every strategic decision had to go through him, and his decisions were increasingly emotional, not logical. When things went wrong, he blamed his officers, not his own arrogance. The same man who once claimed to be a military genius was now gambling with millions of lives based on gut feeling and ideology. The diversion from Moscow was one of those gambles. He believed that seizing the oil fields in the south would cripple the Soviet economy and secure fuel for his own army. But he didn't grasp the cost. In chasing resources, he lost the war's most strategic prize, the Soviet capital. Moscow was more than just a city. It was the heart of Soviet logistics, communication, and morale. Capturing it could have ended the war. Failing to do so ensured it would drag on for 4 more brutal years. By 1942, Germany's situation had deteriorated. The army was stretched thin across thousands of miles of front. The Luftwaffe had lost its air superiority. Fuel shortages became constant. Every campaign demanded more than the nation could supply. The once fearsome Wehrmacht was now bleeding slowly, fighting on too many fronts with too few men and too little equipment. And yet, Hitler refused to admit the truth. Instead of cutting his losses or consolidating his gains, he doubled down. The same mindset that had caused the diversion from Moscow led him to launch the disastrous invasion of Stalingrad the following year. Another dumb decision driven by pride, not strategy. That battle would end with the complete destruction of Germany's Sixth Army and the final collapse of any hope for victory. Historians often call the decision to divert from Moscow the moment Germany lost World War II. It was not a single battle, but a chain reaction of failures born from arrogance. It broke the myth of blitzkrieg, it broke the confidence of German soldiers, and it broke the illusion that Hitler could outthink his own generals. From that point on, the war was no longer about conquering, it was about surviving. Think about it. One man's refusal to listen, one act of overconfidence, changed the fate of millions. Hitler believed he was making a smart, tactical move to grab resources. Instead, he traded a short, winnable war for a long, unwinnable one. He didn't just lose time or soldiers, he lost the very advantage that had made his army powerful: speed, surprise, and unity of command. When you look at the frozen wasteland outside Moscow, you see the grave of that arrogance. Every snow-covered tank, every fallen soldier, every abandoned road tells the same story. The cost of one dumb decision. The war that could have ended in a single summer turned into 4 years of ruin, fire, and blood. Germany would never recover from it, and that's why historians, soldiers, and even strategists today study this moment so closely. It's not just about military tactics, it's about leadership and the danger of believing your own myth. The smartest commanders in history aren't the ones who win every battle. They're the ones who know when to listen, when to adapt, and when not to let ego cloud their judgment. Hitler failed on all 3 counts. So the next time someone talks about the fall of the Third Reich, remember, it didn't start in the ruins of Berlin. It started in the mud outside Moscow, when one man decided he knew better than everyone else. The road to defeat began with a single order, a map full of arrows, and a refusal to admit a mistake. This has been Dumb Historian, where we dig into history's worst decisions and the chaos they created. If you've learned something new, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, because next time we're diving even deeper into the mistakes that changed the world forever.